If psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
There is a sort of pendulum that's swinging back and forth where we kind of go from one extreme.
And I think there's an element of truth to
Because
this.
I have something interesting later in the show that will make you feel very weird.
From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen here in Nashville. We have a great show for you. Our trending topic today is pulp friction, the impact of porn. That's all for Valentine's Day. But first, let's meet our Charlotte panel. Speaking of, Dr. Emma Kate Wright is here. Hello, Emma Kate.
Hi, Dave.
Any Valentine's Day memory that stands out for you?
No. Actually, no.
You don't have a good one from your former fiance?
No.
No? Okay.
No. I really don't have anything. I'm not really into Valentine's Day. So.
I only have one Valentine's Day that was memorable, and that was the first year we were married. We lived up in Philadelphia, and we went to a restaurant that was owned by one of my coworkers' husbands, and they made us a deal to eat in their fancy restaurant, and it cost us $50. And this is while we were on internship. We were like, $50? Can you believe we spent $50 on a meal? So,
wow.
Yeah.
You
Dave
should eat at
couldn't
my
do-
brother's restaurant then, where there will be like a comma in your bill.
Yeah.
I know.
Dave couldn't have any bath bombs for like a year for a $50 meal.
$50. Yeah, that was big deal. That was big money back in the day. Well, you heard Dr. Frank Gaskell. He's with us. And Frank, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I'll be seeing you soon.
I know you're flying to Nash Vegas here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun time. And any standout Valentine's memory for you?
Why, yes. I'm glad you asked. I recall going to a roses department store to get little candies and cards for each of my classmates in the 6th grade. And I signed them, and I got it all ready to go. And I did not get anything on Valentine's Day from anybody in the class.
Frankie got little Valentines for everybody, and no one got one for him.
I never would have predicted that.
I was Charlie Brown in real life.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan Hedderly's here. He's our certified Asian who rounds out our panel. And Jonathan, any memorable Valentine's Day for you?
Why, yes, David, and I'm glad that you asked. It was probably my 2nd year of marriage to my wife, Julie, and I was in a church basketball league, and we had a basketball game on Valentine's Day. And by all accounts, Julie said she was totally fine with me going and playing the game. So I arrive at this church gymnasium, and there are poster-sized pictures of me all over the gymnasium.
No.
With the tagline, "Will you be my Valentine?" And as I walk in, all of my teammates and the opposing team that are warming up turn, and they just give me the slow clap and they're all much older, so none of their wives are there. They're like getting away from their families, whereas my newlywed wife is the only one in the stands there on Valentine's Day.
Very sweet.
It's very sweet.
Well, each week, Jonathan trolls around the internet. He finds a great story of psychology in the news. It's our first segment that we call
Being Human.
So, the 2018 World Health Organization survey of 14,000 students across the globe found that 1 in 3 college freshmen reported dealing with mental health disorders in the years leading up to college. And between 2009 to 2015, the number of students visiting counseling centers at colleges surged by about 30%, while academic enrollment grew by less than 5%. So news outlets have described this rise of mental health problems amongst college students as a crisis. But some mental health professionals question if we're seeing an epidemic or whether or not we're seeing a shift in attitudes, definitions, and the expectation, availability, and willingness to seek mental health treatment. They actually argue that a cultural shift towards normalizing mental illness is the primary reason for the rising numbers. So, Emma Kate, what do you make of these rising numbers, and do you agree with the hypothesis that it's really more about normalizing mental health that's the reason for this number increase?
So first, I love that, it's been highlighting that people are more empowered to seek help. But the thing I have concerns about is when we try to normalize this, it's good that we're making it acceptable, but we also need it to be a crisis to a certain extent, because without that sense of urgency, I'm worried that things aren't going to change. And I guess the term crisis, maybe the connotation of that is negative, where things can spiral out of control. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be that way. So it's almost the lens you view it through. And there's absolutely, the trends are going in the direction of increased diagnoses for mental health disorders. But it's hard to say what one thing is driving that, whether it's student debt, the financial crisis, media, including the news, social media platforms. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this pans out over time.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm sure there's going to be some good studies about this, but the role of social media we've talked about on this podcast before, I feel like is a significant contributor, because our brains are not wired to manage all those relationships. We're supposed to have about 5 or 6 close friends that we can maintain, and then another circle of maybe 20 or 25, and that's our tribe size. And when we see all this other stuff on social media and everybody being happy, and you got 3,000 people you're following, you're gonna get depressed.
Well, I think this has to be a factor, greater awareness, lowering the stigma, and hopefully increasing resources for treatment and care. But there's a lot of other data out there that suggests this isn't just normalizing mental health or mental illness, and this isn't just a college issue. If you look at rates of anxiety and depression, they are increasing amongst significant number of demographics. If you think of suicide rates, up to every age demographic, up to age 75, we are seeing an increase in suicide rates. So it's not as though this is only a college issue. We're seeing the anxiety, the diagnosis of it, the presence of it, surfacing in younger and younger children. So I think there's a lot of other things than just simply our perception and our awareness. I do think that we have a generation of young people that really are lacking adulting skills and resilient skills. And so even if you say like there's greater awareness, they're not demonstrating greater capability of managing it and making healthy choices when they are experiencing depression and anxiety.
And I guess just to add one more thing, my concern is that, so I love, again, that there's more awareness, but my fear is that people are getting stuck versus moving forward, and maybe that's a factor within this younger generation. There are so many more demands that are placed on our kids that parents tend to swoop in and help, and so then when they actually get put on their own and they go to college, things kind of start to fall apart and the wheels fall off. So it's important to be mindful that our kids are resilient in certain aspects that we're kind of not paying attention to, but at the same time, they are really struggling.
Definitely, we're doing a better job of destigmatizing mental health issues, and that's helpful. But like Jonathan said, like Emma Kate said, it doesn't account for the rates of psychiatric conditions going up when you do surveys of just across the board, and that they're behaviorally anchored. Have you done these particular things or felt these particular things? We see the rates of these things going up. My concern is, like Frank's saying, there are a lot of social factors that are contributing to rises in anxiety and depression, but also there's social factors that are contributing, I think, to a decrease in resilience. That kids, college students, I feel like have less resilience for many, many reasons. We've talked about that before here. We'll talk about it again. That's the concern for me, is that, yes, there are a lot of things that are conspiring to get kids more depressed and anxious, but there are also other forces that are conspiring to keep them less resilient, where things roll off of them easier and then they're able to deal with those things. So it is a concern. I think we're absolutely on top of something that's a big deal for us. If you have questions or comments about that topic or you want to weigh in on it, we'd love to hear from you. You can write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. Let's move on to our trending topic, which is pulp friction, the impact of porn. We're doing this for Valentine's Day, appropriately.
Yeah, we are.
Weird.
How about that? And I want to start with a little story.
Oh boy.
Oh, boy.
There we go.
Oh, Davey, will you tell us a bedtime story?
Yeah.
Absolutely, Jonathan. So Frank and I were doing interviews of prominent psychologists at the American Psychological Association's National Convention. And we were interviewing various people, and believe it or not, Philip Zimbardo asked if we would interview him. That's 100% true. And it is on YouTube somewhere. I don't know if we have it on our page, but it is on there.
I found it.
So, and there's a lot of funny things about that interview. But the most funny thing was he's talking about what he thinks is tearing down boys and men in our culture and his sort of premise about all these things. And the interview's, let's say, 45 minutes long. And for 40 of those minutes, he's looking right at me. And then
I'm sitting so close we're touching on the couch.
Oh, yeah.
I'm right next to him.
Yeah, knee to knee. I mean, just right beside him. And then for the 5 minutes that he decides he's going to talk about porn, he looks right at Frank.
Huh, really? Huh.
Yep. Locks eye contact.
Yep.
I couldn't look away. I was sweating. Everybody was laughing. And it was just me. Like, what is happening?
That must have been just a random coincidence.
It was just
right?
a coincidence.
Nothing subconscious there or anything.
So, but to his point, he feels like the accessibility, availability, and just sheer volume of porn is having a very, very damaging impact on the development, the social, emotional, sexual development, particularly of boys and men. Any thoughts about that? Agree, disagree?
I completely agree. And I will add the weird fact that porn makes more money than the NFL, the NBA, and Major League Baseball combined. It also makes more money than ABC, NBC, CBS combined.
No.
Oh,
Yes,
it does.
That's crazy.
It does.
That is true. It is the largest revenue generating industry in the world.
In the world.
Wow.
Because it's also attached to human trafficking and prostitution and all other types of sexual industries.
And at any point in time, there are 30 million people looking at porn now.
Every second. So I have to comment that there was a weird nuclear crisis that happened a couple months ago in Hawaii where they had a text go out that said, what was it? Something like, this is not a drill. There's a nuclear missile coming. And apparently there was a massive surge in users on Pornhub during that time.
Yep.
Wait a minute. When they got the notice that they were going to get hit by a
They're all
nuclear
gonna
missile,
die.
their first instinct
Everybody.
is to go to Pornhub.
There was a really big surge
They were
apparently
very
in traffic
stressed,
on this
Davey.
site.
They needed their stress reliever.
And
No
when
kidding.
when Obama got elected, all the conservative states looked at porn. And when Trump got elected, all the liberal states looked at porn.
Wow. That is some fascinating stuff.
But yeah, I do think porn is contributing to the downfall of boys and men in this country. It's on every device. You can get it on a DS, a Wii. You can get it anywhere all the time for free.
You can get Wii porn.
And these, wow. And you have these 8 to 10-year-olds on an iPad unsupervised because the parents are clueless about it. And that's when boys are first exposed to porn, and that's not good.
Well, but I think in general, though, our culture is absolutely terrified of discussing sex and talking to kids about it. And we still have a lot of abstinence-only programs that
Let's
are
not
out
talk
there.
about that.
Yeah, that's kind of what it's like, though. And I mean, again, and kids are going to be curious. And if parents aren't aware, like Frank said, of what their children are doing online, they're going to be exposed to things. And some of that might be really graphic. So just as a PSA, please monitor your kids' online usage.
So one of the things I can just say is from a anecdotal standpoint, clinically, it used to be that guys would say that they'd found a magazine or even in the early days of the internet looked at porn, but they were usually consistently like 13, 14 and so on and older. And now it's very, very common, maybe even more common, for guys to say that they were looking at porn when they were 6 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old. That I feel like that by itself has got to be an atom bomb in terms of the impact, because that's different. That's not something I'd ever had heard before. It's really only since the advent of all the sort of being able to get porn on every device, high-speed downloads, all that kind of stuff. Jonathan, any thoughts?
Well, yeah, when you think about brain development as a 6 or 7 year old and what it unlocks in terms of just stimulation, confusion, the objectification or devaluing of genders and the opposite sex. And I will tell you, I work with a lot of young men, teenagers and young adults who have intimacy and attachment issues, have horrible relationship histories that have a lot of acting out and coping mechanisms that are really unhealthy and destructive. And they were exposed to porn at an early age by seeing it as their fathers were watching and accessing porn. And so it's not as though oftentimes a 6 or 7 year old is seeking out this content or even knows how. It's that this is an epidemic for adult men of all age demographic. And so then you have young children that get exposed to it. And we're just beginning to see maybe some of the impact it has on brain development, impulse control, stimulation, and healthy relationships.
I was working with a family years ago, and I told them they needed to put some software in the computers to monitor what was going on because the kid was looking at stuff. And the parent came back a couple weeks later and said, I don't think the software is working. There's something wrong with it. What are you talking about? Well, I mean, it says that somebody's looking at porn at like 2 p.m. and he's in school and I'm at work. So, like, there's something wrong with the software. I said, have you talked to your husband? And she went, oh, no. He was coming home and looking at it during the day.
That's crazy. You know what? Though we've also seen, I have a talk called The Truth About Teens, and I talk about the trends that we're seeing with teenagers, and some of them are good, some of them are not good. You know, like there's increase in marijuana use, there's decreases in violence and things like that. One of the trends is that kids of this generation are having sex less often and not only less frequently, less sexual partners. And we usually put that in the plus column. We usually say that's a positive trend. But the truth is that the majority of that is probably due not to I've developed these sort of these moral standards or these kind of like relationship standards. It's really about that you've got a lot of boys that are looking at porn all the time.
They're just worn out.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need demographics of sex with another person and get that type of statistic because absolutely they are in front of some type of screen engaging in some type of sexual activity.
Well, I'm going to tell you, it's about to get way, way worse.
With VR?
Virtual reality.
And Frank would know.
Oh my gosh.
And you think that's gonna make it worse?
Way worse.
I agree with
Why
that.
way worse?
Why do you think it's going to be way worse, Frank?
Because
I'm curious to hear your take on this.
It'll be a 360-degree view. You feel like you're actually there. And full disclosure, I checked it out in our conference room. And I showed it.
You're looking at porn in the conference room?
I wanted to show it to a colleague who her name will stay nameless. And she freaked out, completely freaked out. It's going to be bad. It's going to be really bad.
And then what happened after you showed this clinician porn on the Oculus Rift? What happened?
She ran across the room and immediately bought one on Amazon.
Yeah, I totally hear you.
Well, but with that said, there is really kind of alarming research that's coming out too about porn usage and what it's associated with. So we know porn usage is correlated with lower sexual satisfaction. We also know that porn usage is significantly associated with loneliness and
Making it
higher
sound
rates
bad.
higher rates of divorce. But interestingly, I was doing some research where one study talked about how females who start porn use after being married, so they're picking up their habits more after being married, has a higher correlation for risk of divorce. And then just in general, porn use within the 20s, 30s, and 40s is higher than if you're 50 plus.
They had porn in the 1920s?
Yeah, it's
Of
called
course.
PG-13.
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of the biggest things we're seeing overall, the impact of porn is viewing pornography is a one-sided affair. It requires zero intimacy, vulnerability, the dignity and valuing of another person. It also requires the viewer to have to give any type of sacrifice or commitment to another person. And we're seeing this erosion in relationship. We're seeing it on a social skill level with young people. We're seeing it with less young people are dating, and that really leads to less relationships, less sexual activity amongst teens. And again, I think there's a lot of value in managing risky behaviors and sexual behaviors, but it's part of a larger problem we're seeing. And it's hard not to think that there is some correlation to the pervasiveness of pornography and sexualized material.
Dave, I have a little trivia for you.
Go.
When guys are looking at porn, they're looking at a girl, what do they pay the most attention to with eye tracking software?
Oh, boy.
Oh, boy.
A storyline?
Absolutely.
That's a good question, but I'm gonna go counterintuitive and say the face, eyes.
The eyes, you're right. That's where they look.
Yeah,
Like craving intimacy, but not able to have it.
right. That makes sense. So,
Well,
go ahead.
can I make another comment? Another thing, just to kind of piggyback on some of the stuff you guys have already mentioned.
said piggyback.
Oh, boy. But seriously, though, playing back into the unrealistic expectations when people do actually get into an intimate relationship, because porn does not accurately reflect pleasure, essentially, where it's normally, I think one stat was the majority of it is focused on the male and on male pleasure versus the female. And so then
That's not real life.
it feeds into the devaluing of women sometimes, and not always. And then there's weird issues too relationally in a marriage that can foster insecurity. And some people even view watching porn as a form of infidelity, depending on your particular moral and religious beliefs.
So there's been the argument that any new technology is really ultimately primarily there to facilitate the development of porn and the dissemination of porn.
DVD, yeah.
And you can make that argument. And so what we're seeing with these newer technologies is that obviously porn is just exponentially taken off and become part of the culture. And what we've talked about is there's lots and lots of implications of that are negative. We're talking a lot about kids and teenagers. We're also saying those kids and teenagers are now moving into young adulthood and middle-aged adulthood, and we're going to see these kinds of trends throughout. The question with all that is there anything that we can legitimately do about this? Is there anything that, what, rather than just lament it, how do we think about this in a constructive way, in a way that's helpful?
Well, I think it is an opportunity and I'll speak for the American culture. That's the culture that I've grown up in this society. We have such a tense and unsettling relationship with sexuality. And there's actually a recent television show on Netflix called Sex Education, which I did a recent Psych Cinema episode on. And it was quite frank. It was
That's me.
Yeah, it was quite frank, although we don't normally think of sex and frank together, but for this instance, we will. And it was very adult in its subject matter, but it focused on the female perspective, and it wasn't the old school boys' perspective, vulgar conquest or rites of passage. It was awkward. It was really about everybody being awkward and everybody seeing sex as a healthy and natural expression of connection and intimacy, even at a young adult level. And honestly, that's what we need in America, because it oftentimes there's this very puritanical perspective that it's a hot topic that can't be broached, or it's a punchline and it's a rites of passage for young boys to become men in a very Neanderthal definition of that.
Any other thoughts about what we can do that's constructive?
Early, ongoing conversations with kids, not one talk, but an ongoing conversation.
And maybe to that point, when you're saying early, we used to think of early being 12. Now we're talking about kids who are getting exposed to things, maybe not in their own house, but during a visit to the neighbor's house or a cousin or something like that, at very early ages, 6 and 7 and 8 years old. That's not uncommon. We hear that all the time. So when we talk about early, we mean early.
And I don't want to misquote this, but I know for a fact that the Netherlands, I'm pretty sure it's the Netherlands. I know I said fact.
Netherlands?
I'm sorry.
The Netherlands.
Don't hold me accountable for
regions?
this. Listen, but the Netherlands starts sex education around 5 or 6, but they take a very different approach where it's more about love and intimacy and the relationship. And I don't know exactly the approach, but I do know that there are some countries that have different approaches. That's all. That was not helpful for everyone.
Well, if you have questions or comments about this topic, it's a hot one, and we'll probably revisit it. You can write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. We'd love to hear from you. And our final segment is something that we call Doctor's Orders. These are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture. Emma Kate, what do you have?
I have a very unique recommendation for a book. It's called Body Electric, Electromagnetism and Foundations of Life by the late Robert Becker, who is a neurosurgeon who, in a nutshell, this book is about understanding our body's potential healing capacity and how natural electricity is vital to healing and life in general. And I'll be honest, it was really dense and technical at times, but regardless, I was fascinated by a lot of the content that was discussed. And if anyone is curious about their own potential healing, I would look at that book.
I would like to do 2 quick recommendations. The first one is called Station 11. It's by Emily St. John Mandel. It's a post-apocalyptic, post-pandemic plague, but the characters, one is a Hollywood star and a band of musicians and actors that make their way across the country and try to save the arts from destruction of the world. And the second one would be a film, Dave, you may want to take out, called Shaving Ryan's Privates. That would be one that you might want to just take a look at.
No.
Do it for America. Honor our armed forces. Wow. Okay. How do you follow that up? 2 quick recommendations. I think I already recommended Sex Education, the Netflix show, but in light of our trending topic, take a look at that show. And it's very funny, but it's got a great big heart, and the characters, I think, really depict the awkwardness and the cringy nature of trying to navigate sex as a teenager. And then the other is another Netflix show called Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes. I am fascinated with Ted Bundy and serial killers. I grew up in the Washington State area. So very early on, I was fascinated with Ted Bundy, the notorious serial killer. These tapes come from over 100 hours of audio tapes of Ted Bundy talking. Highly recommend it. Conversations with the Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes.
I've got a great recommendation for you. It's a sitcom on Comedy Central called The Other Two. And the premise is that it's this Bieber-esque kid who has a song that goes viral and he becomes a big deal. And his siblings who are older, they're young adults, who one has been striving to be an actor and the others tried to be successful in her career. It's sort of like the story of them in the shadow of this kid. Very funny, very, very good. Highly recommended. The other two on Comedy Central. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. We hope you'll check out shrinktank.com for great articles and videos, and you can also find links to our Doctor's Orders products, or at least some of them. You can follow us on Twitter at @shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. And for questions or comments, drop us a note. Our email is feedback@shrinktank.com. If you like the show, please give us a review on iTunes. It helps us build our audience, and we greatly appreciate it. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hedderly, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.